The genesis of the North Africa campaign lies largely with one man, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. When the war broke out in September of 1939, the region was divided between three imperial powers, the United Kingdom, France, and Italy. Although Fascist Italy was formally allied with Nazi Germany as part of the Pact of Steel, Mussolini initially decided to keep his nation out of the war until his military was strong enough to fight a large-scale conflict. However, the shocking fall of France in June of 1940 convinced Mussolini to believe that Italy needed to join the war before it was over so he could fulfill his imperial ambitions. On the 10th of June, Italy officially joins the war as an ally of Germany. For Mussolini, Italy's objective in the war was to take advantage of what he believed to be the imminent collapse of the British Empire and occupy its possessions in Africa and the Middle East. Above all else, Mussolini dreamed of making the Mediterranean Sea an Axis lake that would be dominated by a new Roman Empire. The crown jewel of this restored empire would be the Suez Canal and Egypt, which served as the gateway to the vast oil fields of the Middle East. Against the advice of his generals, who argued that the Italian military was not ready to fight an industrial war, Mussolini ordered an invasion of Egypt to begin in August of 1940. For the United Kingdom, Italy's entrance into the war posed an existential threat to the British Empire. Following the fall of France, Britain and her Commonwealth allies stood alone against the Axis powers. The British had a strong presence in the Mediterranean and controlled both entrances into the sea, the Suez Canal and the Straits of Gibraltar. The Suez Canal was especially important as it bridged the gap between the western and eastern halves of the British Empire. Additionally, the island of Malta was a strategically vital British island which dominated the heart of the Mediterranean. Yet, Italy posed a real threat to these imperial holdings. Whereas Germany did not possess a sizable surface fleet, the Italian Regia Marina boasted the fourth largest navy in the world. Furthermore, the Italian navy vastly outnumbered the Allies in North Africa. Because the majority of the British Army was stationed in Britain to defend against a potential German invasion, the Commonwealth forces in Egypt were outnumbered nearly 5-1 by the Italian 10th Army. British Middle East Commander-in-Chief Archibald Wavell understood that Egypt could not fall to the Axis under any circumstances, or else Britain would be cut off from much of its empire. The loss of the Suez Canal would have been especially devastating, as its capture would open the door for the Axis to seize the Middle Eastern oil fields, which fed the British war machine. Therefore, maintaining control over the Mediterranean Sea and Egypt was a strategic and economic necessity for the United Kingdom. In contrast with Mussolini, Hitler sought to defeat the Western democracies before turning his attention to his ultimate war aim, the conquest of the Soviet Union. Once this was achieved, Hitler planned to let the Italians have most of the African continent as spoils of war. When Italy finally launched its invasion of Egypt on the 13th of September 1940, Hitler and the German General Staff had little to no interest in the Mediterranean theatre. However, the Italian attempts to seize Egypt ended disastrously. After halting the under-equipped and poorly led Italian army, General Wavell launched a counterattack with his outnumbered forces and routed the enemy. In one of the most one-sided campaigns in military history, the Allies destroyed the Italian 10th Army in Operation Compass and inflicted over 140,000 casualties while suffering less than 2,000 of their own. The Italian defeat was so decisive that Hitler felt he had no choice but to offer German military assistance in stopping the British before Libya was lost to the Allies. A desperate Mussolini accepted, and thus German involvement in the Desert War began.
Despite occupying numerous territories, Hitler was unable to gain control of an area that would provide enough oil to meet Germany's needs. This was such a big problem for Germany. They even banned the operation of vehicles to determine if the motor vehicles produced in factories were functioning. There are two ways to solve this. Hitler would either seize the oil in the Caucasus. For this, he had to invade Soviet Union without oil, or he can capture the oil in the Middle East before the Operation Barbarossa. For Hitler, seizing oil in the Middle East seemed to be the easier option. Meanwhile, the Italians, who wanted to prove themselves to the Germans, started to make a plan and decided to advance in Africa while Germany fights on Europe. Mussolini simply planned to advance to the Suez Canal and then capture the Middle East under British control, where he could obtain the oil, and if things went according to plan, bring Iran to his side and strike Soviets from south. With the aim of capturing the oil in the Middle East, the Italian army began their invasion of Africa in 1940. Initially, British ships bombed Tobruk and Benghazi, but these attacks did not affect Italians. The British army had only 35,000 troops to face the 150,000 Italian troops, led by Graziani, who quickly broke through their lines and captured Sidi Barrani on September 16. But with just only one offensive, Italian troops lost their capability to make an attack, and they were far behind the planned advance. So they decided to set a defensive line and started to wait for reinforcements. The British Army, with its naval superiority, was able to gather more troops than the Italians and launch an attack once their logistics were fixed and reinforcements arrived. The attack, which began on December 9, 1940, started with British break through the defense lines and begin their advance. In the first stage, the British encircled and destroyed 38,000 Italian troops. Then British managed to split Italian lines to half, leaving the Italians unable to defend themselves. And then British quickly took Sollum. After capturing Sollum, the British established a defensive line and waited. They replaced their tired soldiers with fresh troops from their colonies and began planning their next attack. Meanwhile, the Italians were trying to replenish their forces, but were unexpectedly attacked by the British before they could establish a proper defense. In the end, the Italians were caught off guard by the attack and quickly crumbled, first encircled near the Tobruk, and British quickly eliminated the trapped Italians and continued their advance. While the troops moved forward from the coast, tank units pursued Italian escape routes and destroyed any units attempting to flee. By doing so, the British Army captured significant parts of North Africa and destroyed a large portion of the Italian forces. After these successes, British units were nicknamed Desert Rats. Of course, the arrival of the Desert Fox to challenge them was imminent. Allied forces decided to stop operation when they reached El Agila, because Churchill wanted some of the forces in Africa to defend Greece. During the operation, Italian 10th Army almost destroyed. After the battle, British losses was 500, while Italian losses is 5,000. In conclusion, Mussolini lost the battle in Africa and asked support from Germany. In 1941, when Italy was being pushed back in Africa by counterattacks and was unable to make any progress, Hitler sent soldiers under the command of Erwin Rommel to North Africa to solve the problem. While the Allied countries were focused on helping the Soviet Union, Rommel was going to make a surprise attack in Africa, capture the Suez Canal, and more importantly, advance to take control of the Middle Eastern oil. In fact, in 1940, German command center was unable to locate his division on the French front due to its speed, and the division was nicknamed the Ghost Division. Despite the belief of the British that the newly arrived German troops would take rest, Rommel rallied the Italian and German forces and launched a surprise offensive. The British, who had lost control of Agila in the initial attack, attempted to regroup behind their lines, but were unable to do so. On April 4th, General Erwin Rommel captured Benghazi and continued his advance, encircling and destroying the British 2nd Armoured Division. Just 2 days later, he repeated this feat with the British 3rd Armoured Division, effectively decimating most of the British tank divisions. 2 days later, Indian and British soldiers were surrounded and defeated at Machili. The Germans were driving the British, who were caught off guard, towards Egypt. Rommel then laid siege to Tobruk with his 25,000 soldiers, which was under the protection of both British and Indian forces. The Battle of Tobruk, the largest siege of the front, started on that day. While some forces stayed at Tobruk, rest of the German armies chased the remaining British. Meanwhile, Axis powers carried out 2 large attacks on Tobruk in April but could not achieve a result. Despite the German planes and guns bombing the city, victory was not coming, because even though the British were surrounded, they were able to receive supplies from the sea, while the Germans could not receive reinforcement. After Rommel's great victories, Hitler wanted to send reinforcements. But the bombing of German and Italian ships by British planes departing from Malta made Rommel's job even more difficult. One of the biggest mistakes made by the Axis powers in this front is they could not solve the Malta problem. On the other hand, the British were able to safely obtain all the necessary equipment, fuel, and food from the sea. After replenishing their troops with the incoming support, the British prepared and went on the offensive. Despite his limited resources, Rommel used extraordinary tactics that he was given the nickname of the Tank Commander by his soldiers and was even respected by his enemies. The first goal of the attacking British army was to liberate the army surrounded in Tobruk and push the Germans back to their old lines with them. On May 15th, the British soldiers engaged in conflict with the troops on the border. However, they were unsuccessful in the attack, and Rommel managed to defend against 250 British tanks that came with only 30 tanks. After weeks of bloody clashes, the operation was a failure from the British perspective. Later, British Army, who recovered again, started the Operation Battle Axe. On June 15th, the British initiated a military operation aimed at capturing the German units stationed at the center where Rommel's troops were located, and the Hafaya Pass to reach Sollum. On the third day of the operation, Rommel ordered his troops to move towards the British supply line, causing the British army to retreat in order to avoid being encircled by the Germans. One of the main reasons why the British failed in these two operations was the Germans' Flak 88 guns. German tanks at that time were quite weak in terms of the firepower of their guns. However, the flak guns had a penetrating force of 88mm, a long barrel, and also ability to shot down airplanes. Flak guns became a nightmare to the British army because of it. Rommel not only used those guns, but also had wires attached to the back of the tanks, making the British think that a large number of troops were coming towards them with the dust clouds he created. Sometimes this made them withdraw from the battlefield. In this type of war, the army needs 4 basic things: water, food, fuel, and soldiers. That is, to renew yourself. While Rommel could not provide any of these, while the British could very quickly get resources and support even if they were unsuccessful in 2 operations, Rommel could not provide it. With their renewed armies, the British were thinking of defeating the Germans this time with the Operation Crusader. The British dispatched 770 tanks to the Crusader operation, while Rommel had only 174 German tanks and old Italian tanks. For this reason, Rommel has to lead all his tanks into battle, while the British had a reserve force of 500 tanks. In the operation that started on November 18, Rommel had to retreat due to lack of support. Continuing the operation, British Army broke the siege of Tobruk and surrounded some Italian soldiers and continued their advance. Rommel then, in a planned way, retreated as far as El Agilia to prevent his army from being destroyed. He was inflicting losses on the British Army with surprise attacks, but as a result, he was forced to withdraw to defensive positions at El Agilia. With this, the adventure of the German army in Africa came to an end,